Hello and welcome to another hi-fi update. This week we've got another second-hand CD player, a classic mid-90s CD player by Marantz, the CD-63. Now I recently picked this up from a cash converter shop in my local town. £18.99 for a CD player that originally retailed for £250. Now it didn't come with a remote control, but I just went on eBay and for less than £10 managed to get a remote which is in tip-top condition, and it even had batteries with it as well. So the whole CD player for very little cash. Yeah, pretty much the price of one brand new vinyl record or a couple of CDs. It's not just CDs that can be bought very cheaply at the moment, it's actual CD players can be as well. But this player is from the mid-90s. It's the first in a series of 3 CD-63 players that Marantz made. There was the plain 63, which is what we've got here. There was the 63 SE, which came out the year after. Then there was the 63 KI Signature, which was the top of the range version that came out the year after, I believe in '96. So at that point you actually had 3 models in the range, all based on the same player, all based on this player. This is the basic bottom of the range player. It's a fairly typical CD player from that period, black of course, fairly slim. It's got a blue display, which still lights up very well. So it might flicker in the video, they sometimes do, but so it certainly doesn't flicker in real life. And got a drawer on the side, still works okay, although it's rather noisy. And you've got a headphone socket on the side here as well. Right, if we turn it around and look at the back of the player has captive mains lead, one of my pet hates, but fairly typical for cheap equipment. You have the analog RCA outputs here, left and right. Got remote control things to do with. If you have an entire Marantz system, you can connect it to other things so they all operate off the same remote control. Can be useful. And you've got the SPDIF digital outputs. That's Sony and Philips digital interface, one of which is Toslink, the optical cable, and the other is electrical, the coaxial cable. It's nice to have both of them on the same player. Now this particular player and the 2 special versions of this player which came out afterwards were huge sellers in the UK during the 90s and probably worldwide as well. Now the biggest selling model was actually the SE, the special edition, the model above this. But this one sold quite well too, and back in the day they were highly regarded CD players. Now, it was unusual for Marantz to have 3 versions of what's basically the same player when companies have a multiple model in their range of hi-fi equipment, particularly with CD players. They nearly always give them different names. You'd have maybe a 63, a 73, an 83 or whatever. But here, they've very much made a point of it being a special edition of the standard version rather than a new version of the player. And it's an interesting way to go. And of course, by '96, by the time they had all 3 CD players, you would have been able to go into a hi-fi shop. You've got to remember this is in the mid-90s, it's pre-internet, and you would have been able to hear the 3 CD players side by side, all plugged into the same amplifier. All of them would have operated from the same remote control. You put 3 CDs in, identical CDs, press play, they'd all play simultaneously, and you could switch between the 3 of them on the hi-fi and actually hear what each of them sound like side by side. And apparently, back in the day, from reading the hi-fi press, there was quite a big jump when you moved from the 63 up to the 63 SE, and then a small jump from the SE up to the KI Signature. Now I say this was £250 originally. I think by '96 it had actually gone up to £270. The SE was £350 and the KI Signature was £500. So there's quite a price hike to get to the KI Signature model, but only £80 from this to the SE model. And if there was a very obvious noticeable difference, I think a lot of people would have gone for the SE, and apparently the SE was the biggest selling out of the 3 CD players. But it's an interesting thing for Marantz to do, and an interesting way of marketing the products. Now the first thing to do when you buy a whole second-hand hi-fi is just clean it. What I use is flash with bleach. Very, very good at getting grease off products, but without causing any scratches to the surface. So very, very useful for hi-fi equipment and computer equipment in general. And I usually finish up by using anti-static spray. Just gives a nicer, sort of cleaner finish. The flash bleach can leave a bit of residue, and there's no harm putting anti-static spray on your equipment. So I've turned it around to the back. Now I can clean the electrical contacts. Now to do this, you use specialist electrical contact cleaner. Here I use Deoxit D5, which is the best stuff I found, but there's lots of electrical contact cleaner you can buy. And to clean it, you use these little tiny brushes. The wire brush is used to do the inside of the sockets, and the outside of the sockets is done with the little foam pad. Very, very simple, but very, very important to keep all the electrical contacts in very good condition, and you do that by keeping them clean. This player has a slightly odd quirk in that the headphone socket is controlled by the remote control, which is one of the reasons I absolutely needed to pick up a remote control for the player, and it's controlled digitally, but it only goes to about half volume. It doesn't go from maximum to 0, it goes from maximum to about half, and that half volume is still a little bit too loud on certain headphones that have got high sensitivity. If you're going for, say, late night listening, it doesn't go from maximum to 0, which in my opinion is just bizarre. The other thing is the volume control also affects the RCA output jacks at the back, so you've got volume control there as well, but again, it only goes from maximum to about halfway, not to 0, so you can't use this CD player instead of a preamp. In fact, it doesn't even drop the volume enough to get rid of the problem of voltage overload, which I've featured in a previous video and will feature in a future video as well. So to a large extent, the volume control on both the headphone output and the output jacks is pretty useless. And it is possible to test both the headphone output and the output jack simultaneously by taking a feed from the headphone and put it into this headphone amp, and taking a feed from the output jacks and putting it into the same headphone amp, and then a flick of a switch I can actually switch between the headphone output and the RCA outputs at the back. Why would I want to do this? Because I found a rather strange anomaly. The sound quality from the headphone socket on the front was much better than the sound quality from the RCA output jacks. Much smoother and more refined. Quite bizarre. It's nearly always the other way around. The headphone socket's a bit of an afterthought, and it doesn't sound quite as good. It's just there for convenience, really. If you want good sound, you buy a separate headphone amp. But on this player, it's the other way around. The headphone socket is clearly superior. Even though this output isn't really meant to be fed into RCA inputs, and the levels aren't quite matched, you can still tell it is obviously and clearly superior to the RCA outputs at the back. And this sort of leads me to something of a conclusion. As this player was one of 3, and as these players would have been set up side by side in the hi-fi retailers, so you can actually listen to them, it's quite possible, if I'm being cynical, to say that Marantz deliberately scuppered the performance of this CD player by putting cheap parts in the analog output stage, so that the next model up, its best selling model in the range, the SE, was clearly superior to this one. Being cynical? Yes, but it makes sense. I remember the hi-fi press at the time saying that the SE was a big step up from this one. Well, frankly, if this one had the same quality that's coming out of here, coming out of its output jacks at the back, that would be a big step up in quality as well. It's a very, very unusual situation for the headphone output to be clearly superior to the RCA output. Very unusual indeed. So what do I think of this CD player? And I have to say, I think it looks nice. Obviously that's a matter of opinion. It looks typically 90s, but it looks decent. The remote control is nice, nicely laid out. It all works faultlessly. Only cost me $18.99, so it's a bit of a bargain with a £9 on top of the remote. All very cheap. But the sound quality is extremely poor. The player is very lively, it is very get up and go, an exciting listen, but it is very, very crude. It sounds very, very rough, it sounds very, very raucous, it's very, very unrefined. It is pretty harsh. Without putting too fine a point on it, it's a pretty horrible listen. Not good at all. And throw in the bizarre volume control with regard to the headphone output and the RCA output at the back, and that is certainly a design feature which counts against it as well. And I have to say I'm hugely, hugely disappointed in it. Massively so, in fact. Now, I'm not hating on Marantz as a brand. I've owned more hi-fi separates Marantz CD players than any other make. In fact, this is my 10th player. And this is the only one out of those 10 that I'm disappointed with. I'm very disappointed in Marantz. Normally their CD players are very good. In fact, if before today, if someone had asked me, oh, could you recommend me a CD player, I would have said just go out and buy Marantz. They're all fantastic. Because up till now they have all been fantastic. This one is a big, big disappointment. So it has disappointing sound quality on its own, but what if it's used as a digital transport? I would say mechanically it's very good, it's very nice to use. It's got both digital outputs on the back, optical and the coaxial electrical. So how about using this old CD player with, say, a modern DAC? Makes sense, very, very cheap, $18.99. It's ever so cheap, and you can just plug it into your new DAC, save you money buying a new CD player. And the problem is, a lot of the sonic signature of a CD player comes from its digital transport, comes from the actual disk drive and the various chips and things and the laser and all the rest of it that handle the actual digital signal initially. Then it goes into the DAC, the digital to analog converter, and then the analog output stage. But an awful lot of the sonic signature is in the digital part of the player. That's what a lot of people don't realise. They tend to think it's just ones and zeros and they're all the same. Nothing could be further from the truth. And the sonic signature of this player, when plugged into this DAC, ends up inside the DAC. Normally when this DAC is plugged into the computer via USB, it is very smooth, very, very refined, and frankly, compared with this CD player's analog outputs, it's very high end. It's a completely different league in terms of performance, but you plug this CD player into it and use its other digital inputs, and as I say, the sonic signature from this CD is put into the DAC. Now the DAC it's upbeat, it's more lively in its presentation, but it's also incredibly rough, incredibly raw, raucous, unrefined, pretty horrible. And unfortunately that means this Marantz is absolutely useless as a digital transport as well. So what do I think of the Marantz CD-63? Well, pretty obviously, don't think very much of it at all. You've got to put it in context. Here is the Technics SL-PG490, which I showed a few videos back, and it's a CD player, another bitstream player from a similar period. And while the Marantz is bad, it is better than the Technics. But the Technics was very cheap when it was new, and it sounds cheap and cheerful. Well, frankly, what do you expect? The Marantz is a more upmarket product, and it still sounds cheap and cheerful. It's not acceptable. It's not a very good product at all. Now, this is the plain CD-63. This isn't the SC or the KI signature. And while I don't like this player, I don't think it's worth keeping. I am going to keep it. At some point I'll get a KI signature. They're always on eBay, so they're very big sellers in the day. There's plenty of them second hand. And I want to keep this player so I can actually compare the two side by side. It's obvious listening to this and listening to the way it acts as a digital transport that it's got serious problems with jitter, which could be its main flaw. It could be that the more upmarket models have got better clocks, got better analog output stages or whatever, and they actually sound quite good, because the sound from the headphone amp was actually promising. So it could be a good player, and I know they're very popular players with people who like modding their equipment. So the potential's there, but straight off the shelf, I absolutely cannot recommend this Marantz CD player to anybody. You can get much better players that are pretty much the same price, and you can get massively better players that are maybe only twice the price, you know, literally just a couple of tens of pounds more. It is very, very disappointing CD player indeed. And that's it for this hi-fi update. Thanks for watching.